Hey everybody, this is Scott Allen Miller. Today on Sam IT, we're going to talk about Microsoft's WSUS server, or WSUS, however you want to pronounce it, and ask, is this really widely applicable to the SMB market today? This is a great question, and one that came up today and prompted a lot of discussion online, and I think it's worth delving into because there's a lot of misunderstandings around what it is, what it's for, why it's been around, and what to do with it. So first of all, what is WSUS server? This product from Microsoft is basically a managed repository for your Microsoft updates. It's a great idea, and it mimics tools that have long existed in the Unix space, so it's good that Microsoft got around to doing this, but they've done it for a long time. This is not a new thing. I'm not in any way saying Microsoft is behind. Microsoft's had this for a long time. It's a good product. What WSUS does, basically, is it downloads a large number of Microsoft patches and updates, stores them centrally on what amounts to basically a file server, and then provides you a managed interface to control the machines that are attached to it as far as pushing out updates or blocking updates or delaying updates or whatever. It allows you to manage your environment of updates. By having a central repository, it also allows for a single WAN connection to bring down your updates and not have to bring them down individually for all the different machines in your environment. Of course, if you only have 5 machines and they're all 5 completely different OSs, it's going to bring down 5 copies and it's not going to help you much. But in a normal environment, you have a lot of things that are the same. It only brings down 1 copy and then shares them out to everything. So if you had 100 Windows 10 machines that are all roughly the same, you may cut your bandwidth by 99% is the theory. So WSUS sounds like a great idea. And in many cases, it is, and I don't want to make it sound like it's not. There's lots of places where it's applicable, and the larger your environment, the more likely it is to be applicable. If you have to have Windows, right? So if you're not in a Windows environment, it doesn't matter. But there are basically 2 primary use cases for WSUS. There's a tertiary, and let's start there. The tertiary thing is monitoring your updates. There's more than one way to skin a cat. You don't need WSUS to monitor your updates, but it does make it easy. A lot of people do it for that reason, but you have to be aware that WSUS is not free because it requires a Windows license and it has a lot of actual system overhead to use. It requires a lot of storage. It does a lot of things. So using WSUS purely for reporting is probably not practical. There's other ways to handle this. There's lots of other software that does this, a lot of times for free. You may want to consider that. The other 2 use cases. One is WAN link reduction or optimization. You simply don't need to download as much stuff, as I said. This is important, but it's also important to remember that in a smaller environment, which is what you have in an SMB, you don't have the ability to always leverage this well. You may not have that many of the same machines to deal with, and if you have a lot of machines that are newer, like Windows 10, there are new things called deployment optimization that are part of that, and unless you've turned them off or block them somehow, they will already do most or all, or at least a part, but they're designed to replace WSUS for this functionality without any intervention from you whatsoever. No cost, no extra servers to run, nothing. So spending money to duplicate that may not make any sense. Now, some people say they're not getting the same effect out of that as they would out of WSUS, so your mileage may vary, but it's very important to understand that this, the number 1 key general use case for WSUS, is already, at least in some degree, replicated without that server, and in the future is going to get better and better, and eventually WSUS will have no purpose there, even if there is still some purpose in your environment today. So that's improving over time, and you should test because it may have no value for you already today. The second is controlling your patches. This is also a very big deal, and a lot of shops want to do this, and this is where there is potentially a lot of value in WSUS, but we have to weigh this against how we're able to use it and its value in general. So there's 2 factors. 1, can you effectively delay your patches from WSUS in a way that's good for your environment? Basically, you want to patch your servers as thoroughly and as quickly as possible in nearly all cases. If you're doing anything with WSUS, you're basically going to be stalling that. Now, there are cases where you may be able to get some updates just a little bit sooner by using WSUS, and if that's how you're using it, great, more power to you. That's very unusual, especially in the SMB. That's a big investment for just getting patches a little bit faster, but great. That's a great use case for it. But in the big use case, it's normally used to stall updates for the intended purpose of testing. The problem here is that SMBs especially don't have the financial resources or generally the bandwidth of their teams to do adequate testing. This means that in most cases you're going to have companies that are delaying patches, possibly for a long time, when the patch would have been highly valuable and the testing may not be possible, or if it happens very late or not very thoroughly. If you're a shop that is dedicated to testing and is able to do it quickly and thoroughly, great. If that's a good value for your business, then absolutely WSUS is probably the tool for you and that environment makes sense. But you are the rarity in the SMB. Mostly it is the enterprise that is able to do good level testing before they get patches out. Now, one of the things that's really important here is it's not just that it's important that you test your patches before you deploy them, you have to be able to test them incredibly quickly. For example, you really want to get your patches tested in the same day that they release, because every hour after a patch is released, malware vendors and hackers are using the information from those releases to attack or to prepare to attack your environments. So you want to get those patches out as quickly as possible because you only have so many hours before your vulnerability from the release of those patches goes through the roof. The fact that Microsoft has released those patches means that they are announcing to the world that they have a vulnerability that they are addressing. And anyone who wants to attack your environment is then alerted to the fact that this is just out and they have a very limited window to hit you before you're likely to have applied those patches. So this is a huge attack vector and you specifically want to address it. If you're delaying even 1 or 2 days because you want to test, you're probably creating so much risk that it would be better not to test. If you're only creating a delay of 30 minutes or maybe 2 hours, then your testing is probably a good idea as long as you're actually getting some quality testing done. If you're just delaying, don't just delay. If you're delaying for purposeful testing that is good for your environment, then yes, just make sure it's very, very fast or you have an incredibly good reason for having done it. So if we can accelerate how we use WSUS, it can make sense. But for the majority of us, it's going to end up creating dangerous delays to our patching, and we want to avoid that. In some cases, we want to use WSUS to completely block patches from ever being deployed, and not just delay them, but block them permanently. And that can be useful, but that, again, incredibly rare, and in most cases only applies to old versions of the operating system, which you probably want to also readdress while looking at what's a best practice for you, or a good practice for you. So WSUS, is it still useful? Yes, it has lots of great use cases, but it should be questioned heavily. The traditional reasons why we used it, that patching was really fragile and people wanted to avoid it, that's mostly a myth. And if the way that people tend to do it in the SMB is not a good, healthy process. So if your testing doesn't meet that very specific criteria, you pretty much should assume you should not be delaying your patches at all. And if you're using modern OSs from Microsoft, you can pretty much assume that the majority of the WAN benefits of having WSUS do not exist. You can still use other tools that are free in order to push out patches at scheduled times to ensure that they're going out, that they're happening across the board, that machines are not being missed, and those kinds of things. You don't need to spend the potentially very large amount of money and resources for WSUS to do that. So I hope that answers some questions, at least around my feelings of WSUS. It's definitely a good product, it's important, but it probably doesn't apply to the majority of the SMB. Remember, in the SMB, you have to be really careful of where you're spending your money because we have limited funds in most cases. So WSUS tends to be a very expensive piece of our environment that requires a lot of our time to manage, and those are things we can probably put to better use somewhere else, both the money and our time. Thanks for joining me. Remember to like, subscribe, put your questions below. Tell us how you're using WSUS, and if you want to sponsor us here on SamIT, you can do so on Patreon.